So welcome to my video about brisket. If you noticed my little preview earlier, I said that I don't have a tripod, so you're gonna notice that for this first part of the video, my camera angles are weird. I just got some still photos. I was balancing my phone in one hand, holding the brisket with the other hand, changing gloves 15,000 times because I'm a nurse and a germaphobe and don't do raw meat and cell phones, so bear with me a little bit. The first thing I'm gonna show you is kind of like the spice mixture and the setup, so I'm gonna get into it. So you'll notice I have a few things on the counter. I have some coarse kosher salt. I have a rub shaker, which is actually just a repurposed Sam size spice shaker. I've got some paprika, some black pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder. You're gonna go really heavy on the black pepper, fairly heavy on the paprika, and just a little of the onion and garlic. And all I can say is that you're gonna kind of know by the smell if you've got the right ratio, but I tried to kind of give you an idea in the picture of what it should look like. I did tweak it a little bit after I took this picture, but just a pinch more pepper in it. I kind of go by smell. I've got the nurse's nose or the mom nose. I inherited it from my mom, where I kind of know when food is done by the way it smells. So if you don't have that, I don't know how to help you because I do not have measurements for any of these ingredients. So before we can talk about seasoning our brisket, we need to talk about choosing the correct brisket. You want to make sure you go with a USDA Prime or Choice brisket and not USDA Select unless you are super proficient at this or doing a different method, because those are the ones that are going to dry out on you. The Prime and Choice have a lot more marbling in them and they're a little bit harder to screw up, especially if you're new to this. They also just make a juicier brisket. So I've gone with the USDA Prime brisket. It is a whole brisket, meaning that it has both the flat and the point attached to it. So unless you have a butcher trimmed brisket, or you've bought one where it's just like the flat of the brisket, it's going to have to be trimmed before you can put it on the smoker or start cooking it. So once you've got your brisket out of the packaging, you're going to go ahead and start trimming the fat on it down to about 1/4 of an inch. So about 1/4 of an inch is all that will render during the 12-hour cooking process that lies ahead of us. So we want to make sure that we kind of trim down some of those bigger fat pads that you see. If you have a whole brisket like mine, you'll notice that there is a thick piece of fat in between the flat and the point. You don't need to like waste all day trying to get all of that out of there. And that will not completely render down, but you're also not going to get it all out of there. You'll wind up digging the piece of meat in half if you try to get it all. But on the top and the back side and the sides, you're going to try to trim that down to about 1/4 of an inch. Once you've got all of your spices in the rub shaker, you're going to go ahead and give that a good shake. Make sure those are blended up nice and evenly in your shaker. You're going to start with your kosher salt first and separately so that you can kind of control the amount of salt. You don't need just a terrible lot, but a nice thin, even layer, just a little shake all over the whole brisket. And then you're gonna go in with your rub and you're gonna put it on pretty thick. Now, the term rub I use a little bit loosely because we are not actually rubbing the spices into the meat. You're more or less patting it. So shake and pat, but don't really rub because it's just going to come off if you rub it. I know you're probably thinking that looks like a whole lot of seasoning, but it is a big piece of beef and it can take a whole lot of seasoning. So we are now ready to go ahead and go put that out on the smoker. There's arguments out there on whether you need to use a water bath in the meat chamber or not. I personally prefer to have a pan of water closest to the fire, and also remember to set your meat down so that the thickest part, the point of the brisket, is closest to the fire and the thinnest part is furthest away, because that thin part will turn to charcoal if it faces the fire for the entire smoke. So this is the point of the brisket, this is the flat faces away from the fire. So back when I kind of started this whole barbecue endeavor, I only did it because we had an offset smoker that nobody in the house knew how to use. So I started Googling because what do we do in 2024 when we don't know how to do something? We go to Google, right? So I looked up some recipes, found some YouTube videos, and really went down an ADHD rabbit hole there, just trying to figure this out because as it turns out, there's a lot more science involved than I ever thought could be involved in a recipe. So especially if you're using one of these offset smokers like I have. The big thing with a brisket recipe or any really kind of smoked meat recipe is it's more reliant on the actual smoking process than it is the seasoning or the prep work. So firebox management is key. There's a whole lot of YouTube videos where you can kind of look that up, but just the overview there is that you have your chimney on your smoker, if you have an offset smoker, and you have the little door with a little adjustable door on it, and you have to kind of play with those. It's really a lot of trial and error when it comes to this kind of stuff, but you've got to play with those to keep your fire oxygenated. So if you're a nerd like me, you know that to have a fire, you need a fuel source and you need oxygen to keep it burning and regulated. So we want to try to keep our temp gauge here between 225 and 250 if we can. And to do that, we're going to be stoking our fire periodically throughout the barbecue process, and we're going to be messing with the doors, kind of letting in oxygen, taking away oxygen. And the way we're going to kind of gauge that is, one, the temperature gauge on the top of the smoker, and two, the type of smoke that's coming out of the chimney. So I mentioned briefly at some other point that we don't want to see a lot of puffy white smoke coming out of that chimney. That kind of gives your meat more of that toxic ashtray smoky flavor, and not good like hickory smoke or apple smoke or whatever you're smoking with kind of flavor. So if you see that, you want to open your cook chamber, open your firebox, and let that smoke out, and then try to fix the problem. So it could be that we need to stoke the fire a little bit. We need to rearrange the wood that's in the firebox because maybe there's a part of it that's just kind of burning a little bit dirtier. Or maybe we need to adjust the oxygen flow into the firebox chamber. So lots of little things. There's a lot of videos out there on how to do that, but that has been kind of what's been fun for me in this whole process, is that it's like a giant science experiment. It is not a cheap way to prepare your food. So if you're thinking that you're going to get off cheaper than if you just order some from the local barbecue joint, not the case. This is definitely, you're paying for a hobby, a science experiment. I will kind of try to show you a little bit more of the process. I am a cheater because we can only get enough smoke to actually give it smoke flavor in the first 4 hours. I do move it to the oven and let it cook overnight instead of standing over the smoker for 12 hours when I know that I'm not really achieving any more smoke flavor by doing that. So I will wrap it and put it in the oven, and I will try to show you a little bit of that process too. So I got my coals white hot first. I've got a mixture of charcoal briquettes in there with some lump charcoal, and I added just a couple little chunks of hickory. I actually prefer a fruit wood like apple, but the pickings were slim when I went shopping, so we're going with hickory, and I'm just using just a little bit of it because hickory and mesquite can kind of overpower the flavor of your meat if you're not careful. So some of the people that I studied said that after the initial firebox full of charcoal, they didn't add charcoal back, but just wood from that point on to keep the fire stoked. And I feel like that's a noble effort if you live near an orchard or somewhere where wood is a lot cheaper than it is here in suburban Oklahoma. So I just use the wood chunks, or I prefer the little logs if I can find them, but a lot of times they are much more expensive than the chunks. And then I get a little chimney going as soon as I start to kind of run low. Don't try this at home, kids. So my charcoals that I put in to add to my firebox are nice and red hot, white all over. I'm going to spread them out a little bit just to give more of an even surface in there. I'm going to add a couple more chunks of wood to it, let them fully engulf in flame before I close the firebox so that I'm not getting that puffy white smoke to my meat, and let it sit for a little while longer.